I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this special episode of Learn Live. Today, I'm joined by Bob Ward. Bob, thanks for joining us again today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I'm Bob Ward, a principal architect for the Azure Data SQL team. And so, Anna, great to be back with you again, talking a little Azure SQL. I think today is about security. So excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you. We're going to have a great day today. I just can feel it. We're continuing our learning path of Azure SQL Fundamentals. This is a learning path on Microsoft Learn with 6 modules that Bob and I have built and maintained, which means updating them very frequently to keep up with the pace of the cloud. Now, Bob, since people are coming in at the security module that we're in, can you tell everyone like a little bit more about where we are, like where we've been, what we're doing now, and what's next?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you think and look at this list right here, we started a couple of weeks ago with a journey of explaining really what is Azure SQL. What is this branding called Azure SQL? Being this combination of Azure Virtual Machine, SQL and Azure Virtual Machine, managed instance and Azure SQL database. And we just talked about the history of Azure SQL, the significance of those different offerings, what to choose when. We kind of went through that whole process, introducing the topic like you would with any good training content. And then last week was all about deploying and configuring Azure SQL. For those of you who do SQL Server today, you're used to installing SQL Server, configuring SQL Server, configuring databases. So we wanted to give you all those kind of type options. But today begins the first module on what we call the meat and potatoes of Azure SQL, which is all about security. And where we're headed next is to continue that journey the next few weeks, talk about performance, availability, and then round it off with, and I know a module you really love, and that's kind of putting it all together in that final week series.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're tuning in for the first time this week, don't worry. I think you'll still learn a lot from this. And all of our previous episodes, so weeks 1 and 2, have been recorded and are available on Channel 9 as well as YouTube. So don't feel like you've missed out. And if you're new to the series, you should go ahead and bookmark your calendar for the same date, same day, same time for the next 3 weeks, because we'll be doing it again. Now, all of this, like I mentioned at the beginning, is related to something on Microsoft Learn. Now, the greatest part about Microsoft Learn is that you can get hands-on with all the demos you're going to see for free because they have a free sandbox environment for you. And I had something kind of fun. I don't know if you'd seen this, of course. Now my VM has locked me out, but let me show you something. Bob, did you know that at the top of our learning path, they're actually advertising our session here?
We've made it to the big time. We're advertised on television. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
It feels pretty cool. So, you can go in and you can click this save the date button and actually get a calendar invite. So you block off your calendar and make sure you join us for the rest of the sessions. Now, all the sessions we're doing here today are live and interactive. So what that means is that you can head over to Learn TV, that's aka.ms/LearnTV. So from wherever you're streaming from, if you want to interact with us and take part in our knowledge checks, which are really fun, Bob really enjoys them, you'll want to go over to Learn TV because that's how we have it kind of a little bit better organized to kind of facilitate answering your questions and showing the answers from the knowledge checks. And also, we have some wonderful SMEs standing by. So SMEs are subject matter experts from our team, so from the Azure SQL product group, standing by to answer any questions you have about security or really anything related to Azure SQL. They are there to answer those questions, so please keep them coming. All right, so I think we've talked enough about the platform and what's going on. Hopefully you all are ready for the first meat and potatoes, as Bob would say, of Azure SQL. We're going to be talking about security. So what that means for your network, for access, for protecting your data, for logging and keeping track of all this information, and then even some more details into that. And we have quite a few really cool demos today that I think you're going to enjoy. Now, this is the first module that we're really getting into the capabilities and the tasks. So before we get into that, I just wanted to share a few things about the structure of this. Bob mentioned in one of our earlier weeks that we try to breadcrumb everything. So at the bottom of the screen, you can keep track of where we are in the module and what we're covering, just so you kind of get a status of like, okay, where am I? How much more is there? What else are they going to talk about? You can keep yourself updated. But then additionally, for all of the meat and potatoes modules, we've separated things into capabilities and tasks because this is really important as a data professional. You want to understand, okay, what are the capabilities of Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance? And then what does that mean for me? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for like the things that you have to do as the manager or data professional working with Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance? And, there's a lot of things up on here, Bob, as you think about the things you see here and Azure SQL security, what really stands out to you?
Well, it's kind of broken down into 4 areas, and not necessarily in a certain order, but if you think about what you do with SQL Server today, one of the things you have to consider is how do you implement and deploy and configure SQL Server to ensure it's configured correctly for security points from a network perspective? Like, is it part of a virtual network and how is that protected? Do you have firewalls? You're going to find out what we're going to talk today about Azure SQL with things like private link, some of those kind of type concepts. And I think you're going to like this section. Anna does a really good job here because we really struggle to talk about how much we talk about networking with Azure SQL, given the fact that we've discovered a lot of data professionals, that's not their expertise. So I think you're going to see a great balance of giving enough information to understand about network security, and then working, of course, with your perhaps networking team to go further. So network security kind of starts there, and that's where we're going to start that journey today. Now, you got to get authenticated to SQL Server, and the same thing applies to Azure SQL today, and you need access to the actual SQL instance and the resources. And so what you're going to love about this section is because of the fact that Azure SQL is deployed in Azure, we're going to talk about authentication when it comes to being outside of SQL and in the Azure ecosystem. Remember, we talked about that concept in the first module, Azure ecosystem. And then we'll talk about how to get authentication access to SQL itself within SQL itself, whether it's SQL database or managed instance. You want to protect your data, whether it's connections, data at rest, data inside the SQL instance itself. And so we're going to talk all about different types of data protection techniques, including an interesting discussion about dynamic data masking, which we found a lot of our customers aren't aware of is available in SQL and in Azure SQL. And then finally, you need to manage certain aspects of security, especially when it comes to auditing. But you may want to understand, like, are there more things in Azure SQL that I get the power of because of the fact that I'm in Azure? So we're going to talk about things like vulnerability assessments, data classifications, and a very interesting discussion towards the end of this module about advanced threat protection. So Anna, if you combine network security, access, identity, authentication, data protection, security management, we really do believe Azure SQL is an enterprise class capabilities for security, just like SQL Server does. But we're going to show you how to put that all together in terms of capabilities and tasks within the Azure ecosystem. So I think, Anna, the best way to start is maybe talking about the concept of network security.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. And, you and I went back and forth on how much network security to include here. But I think we ultimately decided that, it was important for folks to have a general understanding of what's happening so they can work with other teams, other networking teams, but also be aware of how people are potentially getting access to this. What are your thoughts kind of on that?
Well, I struggle with it too, because I'm not a networking expert. But you have to know enough capabilities and how to make the basics of it work, because you need to go to your team to explain, is it possible to secure the deployment of Azure SQL in a way that fits our business requirements? You have to understand, is there a firewall concept? Should I use that? Is there a way to ensure that SQL is not actually exposed on the internet? Is that even possible? Because many people think that's not possible. So Anna, the way I love you've approached this is why not use visualizations and demonstrations to kind of show what is possible with Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, enough information for you to then go to your networking to say, hey, this is how it's possible to configure Azure SQL so it can meet our security needs of our enterprise.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we will get right into that. I did notice we had a question coming in. So again, just feel free to keep sending in your questions. This question is a great question, so I'm going to interrupt our spiel. This guest says, hi, do you have recommendations on which books to read for a beginner? Bob, do you have some thoughts on that?
Love the shameless plug. Whoever that is, I guess the check's in the mail. We're going to talk about we're going to give you a lot of resources at the end. So if you hear us talk about various things, and I already even mentioned the fundamentals we're talking about today, we're going to give you a resources slide to talk about all different things where you can go further. And I have to admit, and I did go on a journey last year writing a book called Azure SQL Revealed, where if you're a SQL Server professional today and you want to get started with Azure SQL, this is probably could be a good book for you, because we're going to go over all aspects of Azure SQL, including the history of Azure SQL and a great comparison of how you take your SQL knowledge today and get into Azure itself. And I think you're going to love it because it's a little bit in a way a deeper of some of the things that we've done already or are going to do further in this series.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. And we'll put the URL in the chat, but it's aka.ms/Azure SQL book. Okay, so let's get back to network security. All right, so like Bob mentioned, we're going to use some visualizations to get everyone on the same page. I'm going to try to assume that you know nothing and we're going to all get to the same level. We're going to go pretty deep, pretty fast. So try to stick with me. All right, so this is my simulated Azure environment. What you see first is these 3 blue boxes. Now, these are supposed to represent virtual networks, which is a way of grouping networks and grouping resources together in Azure within a virtual network. So you can see I have a virtual network in West US and I have 2 in East US, but they are different virtual networks. Now, on top of that, what I have in each of these virtual networks, I have an Azure virtual machine that's trying to connect to SQL, so to Azure SQL database in this case. Now, this Azure virtual machine has a public IP address, which you're seeing right now, but it also has a private IP address. And while these are virtual machines, you can also kind of substitute in app service or other Azure services that might fall into a virtual network. Okay, so then over here on the right, what we have is our Azure SQL database logical server, which we're going to try to connect to. And in blue, we also have some information about the DNS hierarchy. So this is going to be publicly available information about your database server, just given the name. And I'll show you that in a demo as well. And then finally, we have this little building that says on-prem to kind of represent an on-prem type of network. All right, so now we have the resources defined. Let's look at the first scenario. So in this first scenario, let's say you set up the option, allow access to Azure services. Now, there are 4 options we're going to talk about today, and we're going to go from least secure to most secure, at least from our recommendations perspective. So with allow access to Azure services, this is really easy to set up. You can set it up during deployment. You just flip a switch, and anything in Azure can try to connect to your service. Now, it would still need to be able to authenticate, but from a making a connection, it would be able, from a networking perspective, it would be able to connect. Now, you don't have to set up any of these individual rules. It just happens because you're saying anything in Azure can connect. Now, some of the downsides is that this doesn't allow for your on-prem network to be able to connect, and it doesn't, it makes it so that even, it doesn't mean just your subscription in Azure. It means any Azure resource anywhere can try to connect to your database server. So this is great for things like dev test. However, when you move into production or move into more serious workloads, you might consider turning this option off. Now, if you do that, the next option you have is firewall rules. Now, what you'll notice is none of these connections really change, except now we can connect from on-prem. And just like it kind of suggests by the name of firewall rules, what it means is that you can create a firewall rule for each of these services, so your Azure service and your 3 virtual machines. You create 4 firewall rules to connect to all of those things, and that's going to allow you to connect. But some of the cons of this is that you're having to specify a firewall rule. Now, many virtual machines, and especially if you're using VPN, have dynamic IP addresses. So you're going to have to find a way, and there are ways to manage this, but you're going to have to find a way to manage every single IP address that's needing to connect to this database server and then update accordingly these rules. So that can be a bit of a headache. From a securities perspective, some other things that you might notice is that this DNS hierarchy is still pretty public. So we'll take a look in a demo, but you're seeing information about the region that it's in, maybe even the control ring that it's in, just information you might not want to be publicly available about your database server. Now, I wanted to note that you can use a combination of firewall rules and allow access to Azure services. That's something I see people often do, again, in dev test. However, like I mentioned, some things with the firewall rules and then wanting to turn allow access to Azure services off might lead a lot of customers into the next level of security, which is virtual network rules. Now, I want you to notice a few things that had changed. So what happened is now we're connecting from the private IP of our virtual machines. So this is a more secure way of connecting, because what it proves is that we're connecting from within the virtual network as opposed to publicly over public IP addresses. Now, in addition to that, you notice that we're using some virtual network technologies, and I'm not going to talk a ton about these, but these are basically different ways to connect virtual networks or even on-premises networks together. So what we've done here between VNet peering, VNet to VNet, and something like VPN express route is we've connected everything to this virtual network, and then we created one, so we only had to create one virtual network rule to this virtual network, and now we can connect to this database server from all of these options. So this definitely makes it a lot easier than connecting from firewall rules, but again, it's a little bit more secure because we're connecting from inside. Only the virtual networks that we've specified can connect. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is this public DNS hierarchy is still containing a lot of information you might not want available: the region, the control ring, a public IP address. So what we came out with more recently is something called private link. Now, notice not a ton changed in this picture. We're still connecting virtual networks together and connecting from a virtual network. The big difference is this: we deployed a private endpoint into a virtual network. So we basically gave our Azure SQL database server a private IP address and said things can only connect through this private endpoint to the database server. Now, what this is going to allow us to also do is potentially turn off access to the internet if we want. So this can make it really locked down and very secure. And finally, what we did is you'll notice now there's less information available in the public DNS hierarchy. So we're only seeing things that we can't really do a lot with. Now, I know that was a lot, so I have a little demo, and we can just take a look at some of these things and see kind of how they work out and how you might actually see things like the public DNS hierarchy. I'm going to switch over to my VM, and first we're going to start with this database server I have. It's just called AWS Server DR. It's meant to be a disaster recovery server for something else that I do. But what I wanted to show you is down here on the left-hand side under firewalls and virtual networks, you'll see that right now I'm using an IP address rule. So I've added the IP address of this virtual machine. And in addition to that, I could allow Azure services and resources access to the server to on. Now, either one of those things is going to allow me to access this database using the what's known as here as the public IP address of my virtual machine. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. So I'm going to switch over to PowerShell, and what I'm doing is an NS lookup on that DR server. And so what we're seeing is a few things. Now, some of these things are kind of interesting. So for example, this address here, this is for any Azure resource. So regardless of public IP address, private IP address, type of resource, you're going to get this Azure IP address returned. However, since this is using a public IP address, you're seeing some information about the database you might not want to be able to see publicly, like the control ring, the region, a public IP address, things like the data slice. These are some things you might not want to be publicly available. Now, another thing we can use is in SQL Server Management Studio, what you can see is I have a very simple query. It's basically selecting the client net address. So this is saying, what IP address am I connecting from? And we can just confirm that we are connected to that DR server. We'll go ahead and connect, and we can run this, and we can see that we're also connecting from the public IP address of this virtual machine. Now, this is going to be the same whether we're using allow access to Azure services or firewall rules. Now, when this changes is if we decide to use virtual network rules or private endpoints. Let me just show you real quick. I have another Azure resource here. Now, this is the non-DR server. And down in firewalls and virtual networks, I can see that I've actually turned off allow access to Azure services. I don't have any firewall rules configured, and I don't have any virtual network rules. Now, if I go into private endpoint, I can see that I do have a private endpoint that is enabled and approved for this server. So let's see how that changes things. So I'm going to go back to SSMS. And we can go ahead and we can change this connection. I'm going to change it to the main server. Go ahead and connect. And we'll run this. And now we're seeing this other IP address. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what is this other IP address? Well, it's actually, let's take a look. It's actually, so this is the virtual machine I'm connecting into right now. You can see the public IP address. What you can also see is now we're connecting from the private IP address, 10.1.0.4. So we see that again here. Now, I want to note that this is the same result that you'd see even if we were connecting with virtual network rules enabled or private endpoint. Either way, we're coming from within the virtual network, and that's why we're getting this private IP address returned. Now, if we only had virtual network rules enabled, over in PowerShell, we would still see this public DNS hierarchy that you're seeing now for the public endpoint. However, with private link, what you get is something different. So you can kind of compare and contrast these two. So we're still getting that Azure IP address, but down at the bottom, we're getting something very different. So we're not getting any information about the data slice, the region, the control ring, any of that information here. We're only getting this, the name of the server with private link.database.windows.net and a private IP address. Fun fact, note this matches the convention of because it's in the same virtual network as this virtual machine, the 10.1.0. That's kind of the virtual network that we're using here. And the interesting thing about all this is that you don't have to change any connection strings. You just keep connecting to this endpoint. So that's really useful if you decide to switch to this at some point in your development. And you can't even try to connect to either of these endpoints either. So that's private link. That's an overview of the things in network security for Azure SQL Database. And, you know, we're not talking about it a lot today. Actually, there's lots more we could go into. There's even some new stuff that's being worked on in this space. But for managed instance, I think a good way to start thinking about it is that it's very similar, except instead of this private endpoint, you basically have a dedicated subnet. So you can think of a subnet as like logical grouping within a virtual network. You have a dedicated subnet where you deploy managed instances into, and then you get some sort of private IP address. Now, I should note, this is something, a fully private DNS hierarchy is something we're still working on per managed instance, but you pretty much get that kind of out the gate. Now, you either have to deploy with this subnet configured, and it has some pretty specific guidelines, or you can deploy a new subnet when you deploy the managed instance with the required configurations. Now, Bob, it was kind of a lot to talk about. Can you kind of take us up a level and tell us, like, okay, how should we think about this and what should we take away from this going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. People can see maybe why we struggle a little bit in how we were going to present this. But I love, Anna, the way you did a logical step-by-step approach, especially in the database side, about try this option, then try this option, then try this option, and then the effects of how you would see that. So maybe we should look at kind of a decision tree. You're thinking in your term, like, how do I do this? So for Azure SQL Database, I think it was very, very clear, Anna made, if you can do private link, do it. That's the most secure method that we recommend, and it is the most thing that we recommend. And then you would deny public network access. Now, to be clear about that, and Anna, you and I have done this a million times. If you're just getting up and running, if you're doing a little dev Azure SQL Database and it's not production, then this may not be the right route for you, right? But for production scenarios, this is what we recommend. And it could be that that's not possible for you. If that's the case, we still recommend turning allow access to Azure services off for production scenarios. For me personally, when I just spin up a database and doing a dev test type scenario, have a lot of VMs that I play with and use in Azure, I would use this allow access to be on, because again, it's a very quick way to get connected to a database. But for production systems, you would turn that off, right? But then if you turn that off, what are you going to do? How are you going to connect? So you're going to use either firewall rules or virtual network rules. Virtual network rules may be a little bit sometimes more complex to set up, but a lot more flexibility, because you don't have to worry about how do I do IP ranges and how do I ensure that they meet the needs of my clients connecting in. So that's kind of Azure SQL Database, how you might approach it. For managed instance, Anna just showed you, you're either going to configure a virtual network as you deploy managed instance or before you do it. Now, let me give you some tips there. Number one, if you're just going to the portal and you're spinning up a managed instance, Part of the portal will lead you to the process of just picking a new VNet for your managed instance, and we'll build it for you. There are several requirements for that VNet to work and the subnets within it. So let's say you're going to do it before you do your managed instance. Now, I experienced this when I used instance tools, and there's a lot of requirements there. So here's what I recommend. We have a really nice thing in the documentation for an ARM template. We've mentioned this before in previous modules. You can use an Azure template in the docs. You just point and click. It'll bring up a series of things you fill out, and it'll build all that necessary requirements to get you up and running with a VNet that you can use for your managed instance. So those are the two different scenarios, but here's the most important point. You may be working in a corporation today or a company where you have very specific requirements or policies and procedures for networking for your SQL server. And you're wondering, how do I go to Azure SQL? Well, we're trying to give you the basic necessary information and decision steps to make so that you can go talk to your networking organization on how to set this up the right way. So in summary, get up to speed fast. There's options we've shown you, but for the really great recommendations for enterprise class production systems, follow our advice, talk to your networking team, and decide what is the best path for you.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely agree with all that. And we're about 30 minutes in, and we really just dove right into it, Bob. We got right into networking and some of the security capabilities and tasks. I'm going to go ahead and put up our first poll. We have a few questions. Maybe we'll take a few now and a few because there's another knowledge check after this. So go ahead and take a stab at this question. Bob, one question we got in the chat is from Patrick, and Patrick says, is there any impact on latency for either options?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly the options, maybe just the options we talked about there. But actually, as it turns out, a lot of those options we mentioned are not going to completely affect your latency options. What's going to more maybe affect that, though, is your choice on what we call a redirect or proxy. I think, Anna, we kind of mentioned that maybe in our last module, but that's where latency is going to become more of a factor for you. So double check those options to use when it comes to things like latency.
Yep, definitely. That's exactly what I was going to say as well. This second question, I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a comment, but Jonathan says, this is very handy. I was only setting up a client SQL server today. I wondered if private endpoint would help.
Yeah, I think the key here is that if you're setting up just SQL Server today, think about how you do things in your network or for your clients. How do you secure it? Do you use a firewall? Do you actually put it in a virtual network? How do you secure things in your data center and then translate to what we're doing? Here's the difference. You're in Azure when you put these things in SQL. And so as Anna talked about, there are certain options where certain pieces of information are exposed on the internet. And if you want to totally lock that down, the private link would definitely help you in that scenario. In fact, it was one of the number one requested things we did in Azure SQL database to ensure that we've highly secured those endpoints.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll add to that, and then we'll answer this question, is I didn't mention, but private link isn't something specific to Azure SQL database. It's something coming to many services in Azure, like storage and other Azure services. So this is something we're adopting because it's becoming the standard. So we're really investing heavily in private link. And all that said, I think it's going to hopefully make the answer to this next question very clear. So the question is, what is the recommended way to protect your network for Azure SQL database? And Bob, I'll let you just take it away.
Well, let's use our process of elimination again, even though I think we just talked about this, right? And as you know, I kind of like to do multiple choice answers that way. So if I looked at this and we talked about what we just said, allow access to Azure services is not the recommended way to protect your network. We said it's the recommended way to get up and fast really easy, but not to protect. So that can't be the answer. We did also mention, and you talked about the fact that firewall rules are good, but you still are using those public IP addresses. So virtual network rules and private link are those really two possibilities on the recommended to protect your network. And we just said that private link is the best recommended way because of the fact that you're not exposing information and you've got that private endpoint not exposed to the internet. So I would pick D.
Yeah, exactly right. And it looks like from our votes that are in, about 90% of people said D. So well done. You guys have passed the first knowledge check. Now, this second one, I will say, is much trickier. So,
but that's what you do, Anna. You just you continue each week to try to trick your audience. You're like that professor nobody wants to get in their class.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that.
Exactly.
I'll add that to my title tagline on Twitter.
You should.
That professor that nobody wants.
That should be the tag. I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this other question. Again, this is a more complicated question, but the question is, consider the example from the unit where the Azure VM public IP address is 174.1.7 blah blah blah, and the Azure VM private IP address is 10.0.0.2. So these numbers are a little bit different than my demo, but these are some example numbers of a public IP address and a private IP address for a virtual machine. Now, the question is really asking, when you're using virtual network rules, so not private link, not firewall rules, you're using virtual network rules to configure network access to Azure SQL database, what's going to be returned from this query that basically returns the IP address from which you're connecting to SSMS. So think about virtual network rules and what that entails. How are you connecting to a SQL database server when you're using virtual network rules? So again, this is a little tricky, but I think you can use Bob's process of elimination and probably get pretty far.
Okay. Are you seeing some stuff come in, Anna?
Yeah, I'm taking a look at what's coming in.
Okay.
And also if we have any questions.
Okay.
But it looks like people are pretty split between A and B. Maybe more B's than A's, but it's kind of changing fast.
Kind of a fluctuating poll, huh? Okay.
Yeah, maybe you can give people a tip for those that haven't answered yet and are maybe between A and B.
Well, let's do process elimination to kind of, you said A and B, so it's good that they're saying that, because if you think about this, there's no way that query could be both or neither. Because by the way, when you first said the question, I had to double check it was the right number to line up with what you said. I just wanted to make sure. We don't want to trick somebody that way.
Did it?
Well, it did, but I know you're tricky. You might have done that, right? So anyways, so C and D cannot be the answer. So you got to limit those. So it's all down to A and B. And again, let's think about this. You've got an Azure VM public and private IP address, but you're using a virtual network rule, which means that the Azure VM is in the virtual network or somehow tied to the virtual network to the database. And we said that within the Azure virtual network system, it's the private IP address that you're going to be connecting with. In fact, you showed a demo to run this exact query, and those weren't the same numbers you showed, but remember, you went over to the portal and said, oh, well, here's my private IP address of my VM, and it lines up this result. So the answer, therefore, has to be B.
Yep, exactly. And it looks like about 55% of you guys got that. So some people got a little tripped up, and that's okay. This is a confusing topic. I would recommend definitely check out the Learn module, which we'll share again the link to that, and kind of review these concepts. It took Bob and us a while, and we met with a few people to make sure we really understood what was happening here and had a good handle on what that means.
But it ties into the last knowledge check, right? What we said, what's our recommended approach? Because you said that the private IP address is what would be used if you use virtual network rules or private links. So it kind of accentuates what we've tried to teach you with those connectivity options.
Yeah, definitely. So now we're going to move forward from networking into access.
Yeah, again, we just did network security. Remember our little areas, the 4 pillars. Now let's talk about identity and access, which really come down to things like authentication. Okay, today you're using SQL Server in your data center with your client, with your customers, and you may be put in a situation where somebody says, oh, you've got a domain account, here's a SQL Server, connect to it and start going. But somebody had to give you a domain account. Or you might be in a scenario where somebody's going to give you permissions on a server, Linux, Windows, whatever it may be, to do things outside of SQL and inside of SQL. Well, how does that work in Azure? And so if you think about the Azure ecosystem that we talked about, there has to be permissions or abilities to do things to even start deploying Azure SQL itself. So Azure Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, you'll hear Anna and I use that term frequently, RBAC. And look at that comment, the very first bullet point. All Azure operations are controlled through RBAC. In fact, that statement applies to everything in Azure. For example, Anna and I today have a subscription. We talked about that in the ecosystem where we have permissions to do things in the subscription. And in that subscription, we have roles like owners. These are, notice the idea of security principal and role-based system. So Anna and I have Active Directory accounts within Microsoft, and then we have permissions within this subscription to do things. Things like owners or contributors or read access. So for example, I could go in a very clever way if I wanted to today. I think I might do that after this session. And I could deny Anna all access to my subscription. That would be kind of fun. You know, it would blow away her demos. Maybe I'll do that in the middle of this.
Really fun.
No, don't do that. But it's really true. So we have roles like contributors or owners. Owners would have obviously more rights than a contributor. But if, for example, if I gave Anna contributor rights to my subscription for everything, she now has access to deploy pretty much anything she wants for Azure within our subscription, within the limits of the subscription. And so notice about the scope here. The scope of these role-based access controls are the subscription itself at a higher level, or even down to a resource group or an actual resource. I kind of love this concept because I could go, Anna could, for example, could create a resource group of several resources for Azure SQL and then limit other people to say, oh, you only have access to go into this managed instance versus maybe a VM or a virtual network within the entire resource group itself. So you have scoping within this RBAC system itself. Now today it's decoupled from SQL security. So you have this concept of outside of managed instance or database and inside SQL. And if you want to know, like, how does that work within Azure? Because a lot of people only see this RBAC through the portal. It actually applies to anything to do with Azure, including things like AzCLI and PowerShell to do operations against Azure resources. We have other things as well. So for example, RBAC allows separation of duties if you think about this. Consider these built-in roles you see here on this screen. This is a really interesting concept. SQL Managed Instance Contributor, for example. I can assign Anna that role within my subscription, and now she's only got the capabilities to deploy managed instances and actually connect into those managed instances. If I gave her that role within even a resource group, she wouldn't be able to see things outside that resource in the group itself. So it kind of gives you that nice scoping of doing security rights, again, outside the SQL, Azure Managed Instance, or database. And these built-in roles are specifically designed for that purpose so that you don't have to go through all the different nuances of using RBAC to assign these specific permissions. So we also have something called Azure Locks. I forgot to mention that. That's kind of nice because we could set that up within our sub or resource group to protect resources from being even modified or deleted. Let's say you wanted to set it up in such a way that even contributors within your subscription couldn't delete resources accidentally. I can use that concept. So Azure RBAC is all, again, about setting up permissions outside of the SQL instances for database and managed instance, but it's a very important part of using the Azure ecosystem. Okay, so you've got RBAC, but then it's like, Bob, that's really interesting, but I need to get authentication to Azure SQL itself. Now in SQL Server today, you have this concept called security modes. One of them is called integrated security only or mixed mode security. You may have seen that as you deploy SQL. And by the way, the default for SQL is integrated only. And of course, that means if you do that, you can't use SQL auth. Now, prior to even just recently, mixed mode, which allows both SQL auth and integrated auth, was actually forced for Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, but we now have in public preview the ability to set up Azure Active Directory only authentication. And we'll talk about the significance of that in a second. So let's assume you got the mixed mode auth going. You have something called SQL auth for a server admin. So when you actually deploy Azure SQL, even if you have only Azure Directory auth only, you're going to put a server level principal. You're going to put a SQL name and a password. And for Azure Database, that is a server level principal for the logical server of all databases for the server you're connecting to. Remember, we talked about last week the idea of a logical server for your databases. That same server admin for managed instance will be a member of the sysadmin server role for the complete instance. Now, I jumped ahead and talked about Azure AD a little bit, and you're like, well, I do need Windows authentication. I don't need just SQL auth. What do? We have Azure Active Directory authentication for that purpose. So let's break down kind of the concepts between logins and users for a managed instance and a database. Take managed instance first. You have the ability to do an Azure AD server admin in addition to this SQL server admin. And in fact, when you do that, if you have Azure Active Directory only set up, that is the only way somebody can connect. The Azure AD only option is interesting because you can create SQL assets like SQL logins. You just can't connect with them as long as that option is turned on. That's a little bit like SQL Server when you can create SQL logins when you're using integrated only authentication. You just can't connect with SQL logins until you turn on this mixed mode concept. So for managed instance, you can have an Azure AD server admin along with the SQL admin. You can have SQL or Azure AD logins. Then you would have database users in your databases, because it is a SQL instance, mapped to those logins. You could even do an actual contained database, just like we do in SQL Server today. And then we have this new concept that we just launched last year called a server trust group. And we use those for instance-to-instance communications, like a distributed transaction scenario. What about Azure Database? How is it different? How is it the same? So first of all, you too can have an Azure AD server admin for your Azure SQL database. You also can have SQL logins, just like you would have for SQL Server itself or for managed instance. And then you have something very interesting. For the logical server, we have some server roles, okay, for limited server admin access, like a login manager or a database manager. And you can assign people to those roles to do specific purposes that are not the full admin capabilities. Now, you can do database users with Azure Database to map to the logins you want. But here's what we recommend, and this is a very interesting aspect to give you that feeling of a contained database with Azure SQL Database. Because remember, that's really what we're trying to build here is you just deploy a database. And that is, you can use Azure AD to have a contained database user. Imagine you going in and not worrying about logins, just create your logical server, create your databases, and use Azure AD to assign users to log in directly to the database. And that is our recommended way to use Azure SQL Database. So that's kind of, Anna, like a breakdown of how I look about your options for authentication to Azure SQL, both for database and managed instance.
Yeah, I think it's really useful. And I think that separation of, what you can do in Azure versus what that means you can do in the database is kind of an important call out. We actually got a question from Steph. Looks like they say, so according to the documentation, what you're saying, the SQL roles can't actually access the database. And I get that to a point because we'd never have non-DBAs doing those things in roles. But what we're struggling with is what's the correct roles for our Azure SQL to mirror as we have for our DBAs for on-prem.
So yeah, I'm not sure if the question is RBAC roles or SQL roles, but for, let's say, the RBAC roles, there are ways to control, and think of it this way. Think about who has access to go deploy a managed instance, for example. So just like today in your environment, you have probably permissions about who has the ability to do setup for SQL Server. In the same concept for Azure, right? That's one big thing. Or who can manage, for example, who can go change the scale for managed instance in the portal versus access within SQL. And then if you think about what's inside Azure SQL, the same concept of roles that SQL supports, that's all there for managed instance and Azure Database. So you can still use all those same concepts within your deployment, but you need to first think about who's going to have access to do things outside the deployment. It could be, by the way, that all you do is give someone specific access to do all the deployments of your needs. And then you're going to give, let's say in our scenario with our subscription, I might be the person that controls everything to do with deployments in Azure. And the only permission I give to Anna is the ability to go connect to Azure SQL and not do anything about the Azure ecosystem itself. That's very, very possible to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. I think that really helped. And if we kind of take a step back and think about, okay, we talked about the capabilities. So what does this mean for you as you go to set up and configure authentication? Now, what I really like about this is that you deploy with your SQL Server admin. Your admin can create other admins. Sometimes maybe that includes an Azure AD admin. Then those admins can create users. And then this is a great part of a lot of what we do in this series is you grant access just like SQL. So at the end of the day, the way you do all those things are the same way that you would do it in your on-prem environment. So we thought it'd be cool to kind of take a look at an example, give us a little break. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back to my VM, which keeps locking me out. And what we can see is we're going to go back into the portal. And I'm going to go to this database. Let's see which one. Give me one moment. So if we go to the server, what we can do, not this server, sorry guys, give me 1 second. Let's go to this server. In the security, in the settings section, we see this option for an Active Directory admin. So that's what Bob was talking about, how you can have this Azure Active Directory admin. And you can note that I've set it here to myself. One important thing to notice here is you can only set one admin here. So if you want this to apply to multiple AD users, then I recommend using some sort of group here instead of a single user. But once you have an AAD admin, then you're able to do things like connect to SQL Server using AAD. So you can see here, I'm connecting to that AW server with my Microsoft or AAD credentials. Now, once I'm connected to that, then I can start going ahead and, just like SQL, granting other users access. So for example, I might start by connecting to master. Let me just make sure I'm connected to the right server. Yep. Okay, so what I can do is I can connect to master and create a login with a password. Now this is something you would do in SQL Server. Now then I can create a new user in a database for that login. So create user for login. And finally, just like SQL, until I give users access, they have no access to read or write data, just like SQL. Now, that's a pretty simple scenario, straightforward. And really what we're trying to show you all is how it really is just like SQL. Now, Bob talked about this idea of contained database users, and this is kind of the standard that we've used for Azure Active Directory, but it's also something you can do in the context of any user database with SQL logins as well. So for example, I'm connected to a database, and what I can do is I can create a new user in the context of that user database. So notice I'm skipping login, I'm just giving user with password. And I had to create Bob Loves Tennessee. I don't know if you guys knew this about Bob. He's a huge Tennessee Titans fan. So his password even relates to Tannehill. Okay, so now Bob can only log into this database. So something interesting about this is this means Bob really only has access to that one database. So he has to put in this database credential. And in fact, if he tries to browse the server, he's not able to. So he's not even able to see what the other databases on the server are. Okay, so now Bob can just log in to only this database. Now, finally, and this is the thing that's a little bit different from on-prem, is this new verbiage around create user from external provider. Now, when it comes to Azure AD users, they must be created as contained database users. So you can use this create user from external provider. You have to be connected as the Azure AD admin. So I couldn't connect as the SQL admin and do this. And then just like SQL, in order for Bob to read or write data, he has to be given access to do that. So this is just a really simple example of how creating users compares to on-prem world. And Bob, in your experience, how does it compare?
Well, think about what we just did. I mean, the SQL stuff you did is just about the same. About the only thing you really showed differently, quite frankly, is this ability to do users that are not logins, which I love. I think people will love that concept. So a lot of stuff you just showed seems very familiar to me. I think the biggest difference that people will find is this RBAC stuff, that you've got to go find a way to set up your access within the Azure ecosystem to even get to the point to deploy or manage your SQL resources. But you know what, Dana? I mean, for me, somebody I've just used Windows, domains, and Linux servers and so forth, it wasn't that difficult to get involved and understand the whole RBAC system. But I just love your demo because once you get all that set up, connecting into SQL, granting all the access, I love the fact you showed those roles because that's everything. You do this stuff all the time. You get a new login, a user, you give them the database reader or writer roles just to get access to data, and you just move forward and use it just like you use SQL today.
Awesome. Yeah. And so now we've kind of talked about identity and access. The next thing is protection, and this is really important. Bob, can you tell us more about encryption?
Yeah, but think also when we just got to that breadcrumb, right? You set up, think about it's almost a little bit in the order how you might do a few things. You set up connectivity a certain way for your assets. You've got RBAC set up, right? You got SQL authentication to get access to stuff. And then now you want to go protect your data. And it all starts with encryption. And SQL's got a really great, rich set of capabilities here that you may be using. So a lot of people don't really spend a lot of time on this, but you probably use this more than you realize, is encrypting connections itself. And what you'll kind of like about Azure SQL is that we enforce connection encryption for database managed instance, provided the client driver you're using supports that. Now, you're asking yourself, well, I don't even know if it does. Well, the newer drivers all just do. And so using connected encryptions is just happening naturally. Or you're going to find out in our best practices, though, you should set that in your client connection, because otherwise we have to do some negotiation to kind of enforce that policy. Now, it could be, though, that what you'd like to do, you'd like to protect yourself from older client drivers to ensure that they enforce this. So you can set what's called a min TLS version, TLS being the protocol we're using for encrypted connections. And so as it turns out, there are certain versions of TLS that are better than the others. And so you could even specify a minimum TLS version. You can do that at the time you deploy your Azure SQL assets or configure it after the fact. And so that might be a way to ensure you're rejecting the older client drivers that don't enforce or don't even work with encrypted connections. So that's the connection side of things. Now, we have standard data level encryptions that we support just like in SQL Server. So we have column level encryption. We've had that for a very long period of time. And then we have transparent data encryption for data at rest. Turns out that's on by default in Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. You can disable those, but it's something we recommend you use in our environments. And there's an easy way to do that when you deploy through the portal, or do that also with your standard SQL commands that you've used just like with SQL Server. Now, you may not have heard of this technology. It dates all the way back to SQL 16 and now enhanced in SQL 19 and Azure SQL, called Always Encryption. And that diagram here to the right kind of explains a little bit of how it works. So think of an end-to-end encryption scheme where pretty much the owner of the application or the business owners control actually the unencryption part of this story. So in SQL Server, we're going to be storing location to where the keys are for the encrypted data, but it prevents things like admins from going in and looking at unencrypted data that has been protected with Always Encrypted. Now, if you're worried about managing those keys, Azure Key Vault is something that's very nice that can be integrated with this story or with any of our encryption stories with Azure SQL, even the ability to bring your own key and store that in the Key Vault. And then one thing we just announced recently with Always Encrypted is the ability to secure enclaves. We announced first the support for that with SQL 19 in 2019, at the end of that year. And now in preview, we have the ability to do enclaves with Azure SQL Database, where the unencryption happens actually on the server side. And the way we implement this is that there's a new set of Azure VMs that support Intel chip technology, where the enclave, which is a memory region on the server engine, this is where all the unencryption happens, so you don't have to use all the way across the wire to go back and do things like certain levels of expression detections. And it actually opens up new rich query capabilities. So that's something we really encourage you to go take a look at if you're going to use this Always Encrypted technology.
Yeah, this is definitely a really hot space that we're in. We're investing a lot here, and it's really interesting to see what the team continues to do as the technology advances. Now, another part of protection might be masking. Now, in SQL Server and Azure SQL, we have this idea of dynamic data masking. So you're seeing an example on the screen here. Let's just take a quick look at it. So we have this T-SQL available that allows me to do things like mask sensitive data. So in this case, we're masking a first name, an email, and maybe even a discount code. And you're seeing we have different functions that we can apply. So we can apply a partial mask with some X's. We can apply an email mask, which is specific for emails, or some sort of random mask and say, hey, just put a random value between these two numbers in. Now, if you want access to any of that information, or you want someone to be able to see it, then you can grant unmask to a specific group or a specific user. So in this case, we have a role. This isn't a built-in role. This is a role for this scenario called data officers. And in that situation, they need to be able to see this data. But for normal end users, they shouldn't be able to see this data. So from a select statement, what you're going to see here is, as a normal end user, what you would see And, one thing to note is that you are seeing random values in that discount code. And then the role data officers are able to see everything that they need to see. And there is one more thing that you get in Azure SQL that you don't get in the on-prem space, and that is this idea of getting recommended fields to mask. So what you can see here is just a screenshot from the Azure portal where you actually go into that dynamic data masking blade, and there's actually some recommendations for you of what we think you should mask. So what type of sensitive data you should mask. And there's a really interesting exercise in the learning path, in the Learn module that you'll hopefully go complete, where you actually go through setting up data classification, which we're going to talk about, auditing, and dynamic data masking all in one kind of end-to-end scenario. So definitely something cool to check out with regards to dynamic data masking. Now, when we talk about, we talked about the capabilities. Now let's talk about the tasks. How do you set this up? How do you configure it? Now, ensuring your application's force connection encryption is going to be very important. You're going to want to set the TLS version, minimum TLS version, to the highest, which at this point is 1.2, if your application is set up for that. If you can do that, definitely recommend doing that. You want to evaluate your use of transparent data encryption, or TDE. Note that this is on by default for new databases in Azure SQL database. So if you're migrating, you need to evaluate if you want to turn this on if it isn't on already. Talked about dynamic data masking and how to take advantage of it. And then really, if you want to go for advanced protection, you can do something like leverage always encrypted. Bob, do you have any other insights on this section and data protection?
Yeah, thanks. One of the things about always encrypted we get common questions about is like, is it really, really limited? And so, things like join, group by, distinct, those common operators you do in things like equality comparison and so forth, that stuff's all supported. So that stuff works as always encrypted. Enclaves opens up that space a little bit more, but it's important to know that some of the basic operators, again, join, group by, distinct, those kind of type things, they all work with always encrypted.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob, for that tip. I think that might be a tip for something coming up in a knowledge check. So hopefully people caught it. I would never do that
to your audience, and would never help them.
You would never. So we're going to go to this first question. This question is about dynamic data masking. Hopefully not a tricky question, but the question says, how can you manage who has access to view masked data? So this is data that's already masked. How do you manage who has access to actually view that masked data in its unmasked form? So hopefully that's a little tip for you. I'm going to take a look and see if we have any questions coming in. Go ahead and post your questions if you have them. Okay, so I do see one question coming in. The question says, do you know any impact on performance after enabling encryption? It's a good question, Bob.
There is always an impact to performance. It's just a basic fundamental nature of doing encryption. It's just a matter of what that impact might be. So for example, TDE, there's a little bit of an impact there, just the basic way the TDE works. But notice that we put it on by default for Azure SQL. We've seen enough customers that feel that the performance impact is negligible enough compared to the benefits that they get from that. Always encrypted? Absolutely. There can be some performance degradation for that. And you hate to say the word it depends, but unfortunately it does, depending on how you set that up. But like always encrypted with secure enclaves can be actually a more efficient way of doing things. Building indexes and so forth, because of the fact that we don't have to exchange with the client the entire time. But even connection encryption requires a negotiation between the client and the server to ensure things are ready to go. But this is where you can help things, because you can force encryption on your client to kind of reduce that traffic. But yes, there always is some penalty with encryption. It just depends on what that penalty looks like compared to your needs to trade off that security with performance, and it depends what options you pick to do. Dynamic data masking, for example, there's no penalty. It doesn't matter, because it's a very easy thing for us to look up to decide how to go, what we're going to return from a result perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. Hopefully that was helpful to our viewer. Okay, let's take a look at this question. Bob, it looks like most people are coming in with the answer B, but a few people are saying D as well. You want to take a stab at this one?
Let's do process elimination again, because we're just teaching people to do these things along the way. So how do you manage who has access to view the data with masked data? So it can't be C, because that's the whole purpose of doing this, right? It can't just be anybody. And it can't be you can't. because that is the idea of doing access to view mask data. When you set up masking, your idea is to set up the mask and then who access it. So it can't be A. So it comes down to these final two here. And notice the answer for D, add masked with T-SQL. That is to add the masking. That is not about who has access to what's masked. Therefore, the answer must be B.
Yes, so it seems like some people got a little tricked about what the question was asking, but add masked with is how you can create the mask, like you said, not how you can kind of manage who gets to see what the mask data is. So it looks like about 85% of you guys got that. So well done. Now we have a question about always encrypted, which Bob threw in a little tip about before we started this knowledge.
What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So hopefully you were paying attention to that. This question says, when doing equality comparisons on encrypted data with always encrypted, which operators are currently supported in Azure SQL? And Bob, we had another question that came in about always encrypted. They said, once I enable it, can I disable it at a later time?
You can. Always encrypted is set up at the column level. So it's T-SQL or actually tools-based with Management Studio. So yes, you have the ability to go turn that on, turn it off as you need. There are certain operations to go through that process, but absolutely. If it's something that, and we actually recommend that you do that. Obviously, with anything like that, you need to be testing out that type of functionality. But it's a column level setting you're doing with your tables. And again, you need to make sure you have your keys set up right. You have something called an attestation service you've got to deal with. There are some complexities to get it going, but it's a very nice technology some of our customers have taken advantage of.
Awesome, thanks. And then one more question. This one's about data at rest encryption, or for TDE. And this is talking about, your key management, I think. They say, can we use an on-prem KMS server for data at rest encryption TDE?
You have the ability to bring your own key, that kind of type thing. You're probably talking about it like the HSM type systems and so forth. So what you really have today is to bring your own key technology, which you would integrate with something like Azure Key Vault. That's your way of having that kind of type functionality.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob. All right, let's take a look at this question. Looks like we've gotten 14 responses. A few more responses are coming in, but it looks like we've got 100% of people saying one answer, and that is D, all of the above. So, Bob, what do you think?
Well, I don't know why that would be the case. I mean, I'm not sure, what's going on there. But, what we talked about specifically about always encrypted was a quality operator, comparisons with these operators. And, the answer, if you just look at this, I even mentioned specifically join and group by, right? So just those two alone are both applicable, which tells you it can't be A or B because it's both, and it can't be C because I just said A and B. It's D is the only possible answer. And we just wanted to emphasize the fact that those type of operations are all possible for you with always encrypted.
Awesome, thanks. I think we have one more knowledge check coming up in this session, but now we're going to move into security management. So we've talked about network security, identity and access, data protection, and now kind of how do you manage, how do you monitor, how do you get alerts? And the first thing we're going to talk about is auditing. So if we think about it, at a high level, you can audit Azure level activities with Azure Monitor Logs. And this kind of makes sense that you're going to be able to audit those Azure activities with Azure Monitor Logs. Now, when we think about managed instance versus database, let's start with Azure SQL Managed Instance. This is using SQL Server Audit. So this is just using what you used in SQL Server. The biggest difference here is that those logs are going to be stored in Azure Blob Storage. You also have the option to use target endpoints of Azure Monitor Logs or Event Hub for this. And when it comes to the options, you have failure or continue, but no shutdown. And that just has to do with the fact that we're keeping your server on. When we think about Azure SQL database auditing, it's slightly different. It uses this thing called Azure SQL Audit, which is powered by SQL Server Audit. And most of the server and database audit action groups are supported. Some of those default action groups include batch completed group, successful database authentication group, and failed database authentication group. So you can keep track of those things. And a few other things that are kind of new is we recently released the addition to audit Microsoft operations. So what that means is if you open a case with support and we go and look in at your database or try to do some analysis, you're going to be able to turn on the capabilities to audit what was done during that investigation. Now, you'll also be able to store and analyze your general audit logs in various places, in Azure Log Analytics, in an Azure storage account, so that's where those XEL files might go, and in Azure Event Hubs. And like I mentioned kind of earlier, in the exercises, there's actually an opportunity to combine these things all together and take a look at the X event log files that are stored in Azure Blob Storage, and take a look at the log analytics dashboard and try to figure out when various things happen. So this can be very useful, and we'll do more on that on the Azure Log Analytics capabilities in coming modules as well.
Yeah, now before I go further, I just want to clarify one thing on one of the questions that came out, because I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but they've been talking about an HSM, which is a way to do extensible key management. So Azure Key Vault has now capabilities to something called a managed HSM. It's in public preview. So go take a look at that if you're looking for the ability to use like custom key type management. Okay, so when you think about auditing, you think overall just more about monitoring and managed security. And so kind of take a step back. If you're looking at monitoring access to Azure SQL resources, you got to look at activity logs. You may even have like event logs today or journals with Linux where you look at these kind of outside operating system type activities. So for Azure, since we're a platform as a service, you need to use activity logs and even RBAC auditing to monitor Azure itself outside of SQL. If you look at Azure SQL Managed Instance, as Anna just talked about, you're going to want to configure SQL Server Audit for Azure Managed Instance. That's going to be a normal way for you to monitor what's going on inside in the actual managed instance. So that's an important concept. And one of the things to keep in mind there, Anna just referenced this a little bit, when you do SQL Server Audit, remember the target for that audit, you do not have access to the file system, so you're going to be doing something different to put this thing into Azure storage. But it is the full SQL Server Audit capabilities with some exceptions, specifically because you can't restart the managed instance. Now for SQL Server, forever, since I've known SQL Server, by default, failed logins go into the error log. You ever run into that scenario where somebody says, I'm trying to connect, I get a login failure, but I don't know why? Well, for very secure reasons, we don't tell you why you can't log in, because somebody would try to go figure out that, oh, it's a bad password, and you would start using that as a way to inject yourself and attack SQL Server. So login failed is a generic message. What you have to do is go into the error log to figure out a state number and more details of why that login failed. So that exists with managed instance because you have access to the error log, and failed logins by default are on. Now, we also have the ability in the engine to track successful logins through a configuration option, but you got to restart SQL Server, so you don't get that with managed instance. However, you have X events. So you can use extended events to actually track both failed and successful logins yourself, redirecting that X event session to say like an Azure Blob Storage for you to analyze later. So for Azure SQL Database, just like Anna talked about, it's called something slightly different using the same technology. We call it Azure SQL Auditing. So configure that for your Azure SQL Database. I had an example, Anna, just recently where I was having a login failure using the new SQL Insights technology that maybe you've heard about as in preview, and I couldn't figure out why things were going on. And I turned on Azure SQL Auditing to figure out why were logins failing. So for example, those state details I just talked about that you would see in an error log, you get to see that in Azure SQL Auditing for your Azure database. So you can solve a problem why somebody can't authenticate and get into your database deployment. Now, one of the things about Azure Database that's interesting, though, is we provide DMVs, metrics, and alerts at the Azure Monitor level or within SQL at the logical server to track events or aggregates of things for auditing for Azure Database. So for example, sys.event log will track things like what you see here, the number of successful or failed connections, or the number of people blocked by a firewall. Therefore, you could do an alert to say, hey, am I seeing a large number of people that are getting blocked by the firewall? I may have set up a firewall and all of a sudden somebody's trying to attack my instance. I could use this to actually go alert myself or see metrics about that. So that's something that's unique to Azure SQL Database to see things at more aggregate level, DMVs, metrics, and alerting. Now, however, just by doing this alone, you may want something more. You may get alerted to more advanced ideas. So there is a way to set up alerts for something called advanced threat protection. And we integrate with something called the Azure Security Center. So in total, you can see all the different things you can do to monitor and set up management for security. But Anna, I think that leads into a topic that we should kind of close on a little bit more, and that is, look at this advanced concepts for security. Would you like to know a little more about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we actually used to call this advanced data security. It was kind of like a term we used. And last fall, we kind of separated this idea of classification with a branding called Azure Defender. Many of you have probably seen Windows Defender from a Windows perspective. Azure Defender being a suite of services across all of the Azure ecosystem, and Azure SQL plays very well into that. So you do have this concept of called data discovery and classification. We introduced that with Azure SQL and SQL 19, the ability to go in and label things within your database at the column level so that you could go in and kind of investigate what types of data are in my system and how secure are they. And maybe things like GDPR classification could be something you could benefit. But the other benefit you would get is you would be able to audit with SQL Server auditing that we talked about anyone who accesses what you've classified in your system. We'll look at a demonstration of that in a second. Azure Defender really comes down to two set of services that we're going to provide as part of your Azure SQL deployment. And what I love about this technology is we really try to make sure this is something we offer across all of our Azure SQL assets, whether it's virtual machine, database, or managed instance. And we're even starting to get down to the path of looking at this for Azure Arc. Vulnerability assessments are us. Think of this like a proactive best practices of us looking at your configuration deployment and giving you suggestions of things you should take action on. And what you'll love about this, Anna, this isn't us just making this stuff up. We're actually using industry benchmarks to go out there and look and see what are best practices we can apply to look at your actual deployment. It's more of a configuration thing, though. But you want something more. Maybe you would like the ability for us to proactively look at people accessing your Azure SQL resources and give you advanced notice of those things. And we call that advanced threat protection. So one example that we've seen here, this is one of the biggest reasons we did this actually, was things like SQL injection attacks. So imagine you've got people constantly out there, and quite frankly, it happens even in maybe your own data center, that are actually trying to go and attack your deployment. And one of the things that they do is something called SQL injection, where they try to run queries against your database. And often this is done through sometimes poorly designed applications where people can go into like a form and type in a string because they know you're taking what you type in that string and attaching that to a dynamic query and throwing it to your SQL server. But what about other things like detecting unusual access to your deployment? And if, for example, you may have set up that network security pattern like you talked about with certain VNets and so forth. What if all of a sudden somebody is trying to connect to your Azure SQL database resource from a region or something else you didn't even anticipate, and it's happening out of nowhere? Well, we can detect that kind of activity and alert you to that. And what I love about this is that it not only allows you to have alerting capabilities, both at like a text and an email scenario, but it also ties in to the overall Azure Security Center so that you can see this across all of your Azure resources. I think, Anna, perhaps the best way to really look at this is perhaps to see a demonstration of this.
Yeah, so, I'd love to take a look.
Yeah, let's go take a look at it, right? Let's see in action. I mean, you've really done a lot of great demonstrations today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me see, give a few seconds here and we'll let that kind of come up.
I can see it.
Perfect. So what you're looking here is an Azure portal, and you've noticed here on this left here, I have pre-selected this data discovery and classification option. Now, you do have the ability with T-SQL to do that, and even look at this, Anna, look at this. You now have the ability, now we're starting down the path of integrating some of these capabilities with that new thing you've heard called Azure Purview. So we're even getting comments and giving you guidance about going down that path. Let's look at just classification as we see it from the Azure portal. Again, you can do this with T-SQL, but what we're doing here from T-SQL is we're looked at your database and we've looked at your column names and said, you know what, we might have some recommendations for you. So you can click here and then notice here for this is based on AdventureWorks example. I can go here and see for all these column names recommendations for the type of data it is or what we call a sensitivity label. So for example, we know a little bit about GDPR. We've spent some time looking at that, and we happen to know that names are something that are part of GDPR compliance. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to make you compliant, but we're going to help you along that journey if you use our recommendations. So I could take this entire list. I could say select. I could say accept recommendations, right? I could then save those recommendations. It'll take a second to save off this data, successfully save this now. I can go back into overview and look at this. I get a graph to show me what are the different labels I have from a sensitivity perspective. Here are the GDPR ones, for example. And then here's the type of information I have. Now, these are rules built into our system to discover what you have, and it's purely based on the names of the columns you put into your tables, but you also have the ability to go configure and add in your own rules manually, either through the portal or do that through T-SQL. So that's data discovery and classification that comes along with what you're using with your Azure SQL deployment. Now, I also can do something with advanced threat protection, Azure Defender specifically. And you notice here in the portal, I have two things that I'm seeing here. One are incidents and alerts, and you can see here I already have a potential SQL injection. And the other are vulnerability assessment findings. Let's look at vulnerability assessments first. Now, what we have here is we have an ID system, and we use that ID system to build and classify in our own internal systems a series of rules. Now, notice here I can go click on one of these, like minimal set of principals should be allowed as fixed members. It's a rule that we provide. And again, what we're doing is a scan of your system, of your deployment. And notice these recommendations we give. Now, I love this for one particular reason that people don't realize. Today, you may be looking at a lot of these different checks at a database level, but does anybody ever go look at their master? Like in this case, this is your logical server. So if you want to, based on this, we could make sure that you're tracking all users from an auditing perspective, or maybe setting up a server level firewall will make sense for your system. Let's go pick on something like database owners are expected. You notice here, Anna, that I've got a risk level. So we actually take a look at some of these rules and say, hey, if you don't have this set up right, we think you're at a high risk. But you want to go in and take a look more at the rules. Like, how do you guys really decide this thing? We give you a description. Notice here, this is that benchmark I was talking about. There's something called FedRAMP, which is an industry standard. So we're looking at FedRAMP as a rule and applying that to your deployment. We even tell you what the query we're using here. So I'll just pull this on you. We can tell you what SQL query we're using. You could actually look at that in the query editor, and we give you a remediation script. So if you wanted to do this, you could actually run the script to actually make sure the rule doesn't fire again. But Anna, you may look at this and notice this is interesting. This is actually a rule set up for doing elastic jobs. So you may say like, look, this is actually allowed in my system. So you could approve this as a baseline, and future scans we do, which we do periodically, we would not fire this rule again. So it's a way for you to decide and customize the rules that you want applied to these standards. Or you could clear the baseline and have us in the next scan pick it up. But let's go back and look at, let's see here. Let me go back and look at more of the injection attack scenario. Let's go back here. Let's pack the database. Let's go back and look at that SQL injection that I mentioned earlier. So I click on this. We're going to give you a lot of information. In fact, I had one happen earlier last month. This is one that happened just a little bit recently to me. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. So I can click on here. I get a lot of interesting information. I can say click view details here. And now we're going to go in to tell you like, where did it come from? We're going to give you investigation steps, and we're going to give you the entire SQL statement. And I notice this pattern, this string pattern. For those of you that kind of follow these type of technologies, this is somebody taking like part of a where clause that somebody built into a form and added in special strings so they can try to run extra commands after this to do things like drop your database. I'm sure that's not something you'd like to do. But I love the ability to look at this because we're going to give you details of the query, who did it, how you can go look at it further in the documentation. We give all sorts of documentation about this. And the beautiful part about this, Anna, is that we can alert you to this. So let me go over and show you this right here. Guess what happened when I turned this on? I got an email. I got an email to show me that I detected a possible exploitation of a SQL injection. So I'm monitoring my email. I can look at this. I can go and hit view alert to see the details in the portal, what this looks like. So I'm giving you that actual proactive notification. And then finally, if I go back over and look at this again, the other thing you can look at here that I really love is I can go in the security center of my overall Azure resources, look at Azure Defender. Now check this out. I'm seeing all this type of coverage across everything I'm doing in Azure. whether it's a server, a Windows or Linux server, a SQL server in VM, a Kubernetes cluster, Azure SQL databases. I get graphs to show me alerts over time. I love this. If I'm somebody that has to worry about my security and Defender, notifications across all my Azure resources, Azure SQL is a part of this, but I see this across all my Azure resources. So, again, Anna, I got data discovery and classification to help me with things like GDPR. I got vulnerability assessments. I'm getting best practices from Microsoft based on industry standards. And I get this idea of Azure Defender where we're looking out for you to see who's attacking or accessing your Azure SQL resources.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a great set of capabilities. And, one of the things I think is just really powerful about advanced threat protection is like how fast that alert comes in. Like in the exercises, you can trigger this yourself, but like it comes in within seconds. Like within seconds, you have it in the Azure portal. And then a few seconds later, you get an email alerting you saying, hey, this thing happened. So it's really powerful.
And remember this, Anna, I can set that up so that it goes out and does that same detection across SQL and Azure VM, Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, and even your existing SQL servers. We have it across your SQL resources, the same technology we're giving you that power of Azure Defender.
Yeah, definitely. I think I did a data exposed episode with one of the PMs for that, and he said, Azure Defender for SQL anywhere.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you guys see is the next set and the final set of knowledge checks. We have some knowledge checks, some important things to close out on before we wrap up. But this first knowledge check is about T-SQL auditing. Now, notice we didn't explicitly cover this, but I think you should think about what you do and don't have access to when you think about this question. So the question is, which of the following T-SQL for auditing is not supported in Azure SQL Managed Instance?
Okay. So are we seeing anything come in on this already? Because you're right, we didn't really call this out. And once again, Anna the professor tries to pull a trick on our audience.
Yeah, that's what I do. You know what? I think we actually have another question being displayed. Let me go ahead.
Really?
We'll skip ahead to that one, and then maybe we can come back to this one if there's time. Give me 1 second.
So we have another question that you're jumping ahead of your audience, give them a harder question.
Yeah.
Back to the tricky question. Okay, I got it. Okay, got you. This is the one they're seeing then, right here.
Yeah, so this is the one they've been answering. It looks like we've already gotten a good number of answers in for this one, but this one is, which of the following are ways you can monitor security-related events for Azure SQL Database? Again, maybe not one we explicitly called out, but hopefully you'll be able to figure it out.
Oh, no, I think we mentioned this one. I think we did cover this, yeah.
So, Bob, I'll go ahead and let you take a stab at it. It looks like a lot of people have said D, a decent number of people said C, and a few people have said B.
B, okay. Well, let's look at this. Which are of the following are ways, which here you go again, are ways. So honestly, you kind of gave them a little bit of a clue when you said ways. I mean, somebody could say, well, she just meant one way, but you did say ways. A is definitely true. We just covered that. We said, hey, Azure SQL auditing, I even gave you guys an example of that. Specifically called out that we have like DMVs where you can go look at the number of successful and failed connections and blocked by firewall. So B is true. Now, if A and B are both true, right, it can't be A or B because they're both true. Therefore, they're eliminated. And it can't be C because A and B are both true, right? Even though Azure Metrics Alerts is true, so D is the only possible answer. And we did say that. Use Azure SQL auditing, or you can actually do Azure Metrics. Remember, I even gave an example. Do an alert to say how many people are blocked by a firewall for I see a large number of those. So D would make sense.
Awesome. Nice work. A decent number of people got that one.
Okay.
Right. I'm going to pop back up this question. I think we might not have it in the polls today, but I still think it's a good one for us to talk about. Bob, why don't you take us through this question?
Sure, absolutely. So which of the following T-SQL for auditing is supported? Oh, no. It says is not supported. There is, once again, Anna Hoffman. So I'll quick mea culpa. Anna did trick me on these in some cases, and I actually questioned her. You know, I'm Bob Ward, right? I said, Anna, no, going, Anna, hey, I don't think this is right. And she's like, well, why don't you read it again, Mr. Ward? Little old Bob Ward, once you read this, and I did, I'm like, oh, you said not. So this is the key here. It's a not, right? So T-SQL auditing, not supported. Okay. So look at this, what we talked about. We said you can do SQL audits to Azure storage, and therefore the answer A can't apply because it says not supported, right? We talked about doing auditing to things like event hubs or other resources. So B works, therefore not doesn't apply. And it can't be all of above because A and B, can't apply. So the only possible answer is C, but we specifically said you don't have access to the file system. Keep that in mind with all of Azure SQL paths, database and managed instance. We're abstracting you from the VM, the operating system, and the file system. So guess what your file system is? It's Azure storage. So when you do like X events or auditing and so forth to a file system, you're going to use Azure storage, and we're going to give you capabilities to actually do that.
Awesome. Yeah. Well done, Bob. And it looks like we tricked about half of the people.
Oh, we have it. We have a poll. We have a poll up for it. Okay.
Yeah, it did come up. It looks like a lot of people said C, but some people said all of the above. So they missed some of the not and maybe got.
Well, even if you said is, right, it couldn't be that because you can't do the file. So, but yeah, once again, Anna tricking the audience. I hope these are helpful, though. We have found, quite frankly, Anna, I know you feel the same way. We've really found that the knowledge measures really kind of add a wholeness to the learning that we're providing.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And yeah, I definitely agree. I think, people enjoy these knowledge checks. It helps engage. We wish we could be in a room in person with you all, but this helps us gauge and kind of engage with you all and see where you're at. Just to wrap up quickly, we covered a lot today. We talked about the security capabilities with regards to authentication, network, data protection, and also the tasks that requires for you. We also talked about Azure Defender, how to configure your network, what's the most secure, and other topics like that. And we have so many resources for you. I know someone asked earlier about books for getting started. There are 2 books here that we've been a part of in the past year, so definitely check those out. This learning path is at that first URL, aka.ms/Azure SQL Fundamentals. And I would love if you would tune into our show. Here's a shameless plug for Data Exposed. Actually, Bob, you're coming on the show this week with Buck Woody, and we're doing a special Ask the Expert session. So that's in the same place on Learn TV at 9 a.m. Pacific on Wednesday. So Bob, that'll be interesting. People can ask whatever questions they want, especially if they didn't get them answered here. That's a great place.
Yeah, but did you say Buck Woody? Okay.
Yeah, he's also
going to prep myself for that. And I want to give also a quick plug for your show, Data Exposed. I mean, you talk about getting like the latest news on what's going on with Azure, with SQL. You get it in this show from everybody. You get so many different experts, and it seems like you're doing a show like 2 every week or something crazy like that. But also a plug for Azure SQL for beginners. If you kind of liked what you heard today, how about 60 plus videos of Anna but again, in little bite-sized chunks going through this process. And here's one last thing for you to consider. Anna, people have come to us directly and said the DP300 exam, I think what it's called, which is a certification for Azure for relational databases, they've just taken this training. And they've passed that exam just by doing that. Wasn't our intention, but we think it's a great benefit to all of you out there.
Yeah, definitely. So more reason to go ahead and complete this module on Microsoft Learn. That's that URL for you, Learn Secure Azure SQL. And, mark your calendars because we're going to keep going. So we're about halfway through. We've got 3 more great modules to cover over the next 3 weeks at the same place. At the same time, we're really looking forward to continuing to dive into what Bob calls the meat and potatoes of SQL Server as we talk about performance, availability, and putting it all together. We've got some interesting exercises, some interesting new demos and new content for you all. Finally, just want to say thank you for spending time with us today. Bob, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, we know everybody in here has so much stuff they're doing today just in their jobs, but we really appreciate you taking the time today to listen to us. We really believe big in this content. If you're a SQL Server person, you want to learn Azure SQL, we think this is the right content for you to learn. And Anna, it's always a pleasure to get together with you. For me, I always learn something from you as well. So thanks, Anna, for having me on today. And thanks everybody for joining us today on Learn Live with Azure SQL.
Thanks. See you next week.